Come the 1980s, Ford were dominating the sales charts, and they were masters at sprinkling stardust over their everyday range. And we've gathered three such examples together today: a Fiesta RS Turbo, an Escort RS Turbo, and a Sierra Sapphire RS Cosworth. We thought we'd try out these turbocharged icons to see which one we prefer.
But first, our friends at Lancaster Insurance are running monthly giveaways. You can win all sorts, from experience days to tools, restaurant vouchers and tech. So click the link below at the end of the video to enter their latest competition.
Safe to say, Ford's partnership with Cosworth in the 80s was a resounding success. Not only did Ford achieve huge motorsport success, it sprinkled some welcome halo effect on its Sierra, which was often much criticised for its jelly mould styling. The Cosworth made the Sierra cool. But the story goes that Ford kind of got a bit excited, and after the Cosworth 500 ordered another 10,000 Cosworth engines, even though they didn't really have a need for them. And by 1987, the second generation Sierra was out, complete with its four-door cousin, the Sapphire as it was known in the UK. So what to do with all those fabulous YBB engines? Well, they took the heavily modified Pinto 2-litre 16-valve turbocharged unit and decided to slot it into the Sapphire to make a slightly more grown-up performance version of the Sierra. So the Sierra Sapphire Cosworth was born. The Sapphire had lost some of its lairiness. Gone was the whale tail, gone was the distinctive RS 3-spoke steering wheel, and in many ways it looked largely like a slightly warmed over gear model. All the interior trim is much the same, bar these lovely side-bolstered Recaro seats. But besides the subdued styling, there was still a performance menace. 204 horsepower, 150 mile/h top speed, and a 0 to 60 time of just a shade over 6 seconds. When it was first introduced in 1988, the Sierra Sapphire Cosworth was two-wheel drive like its predecessor, but there was always ambitions to make it all-wheel drive. So Ford strapped on the MT75 gearbox and all-wheel drivetrain. The Sierra Sapphire Cosworth 4x4 was born, introduced in January 1990. By this point, the Sierra Cosworth really has grown up. It's far removed from its leery, whale-tailed version. The trouble is it also lost some of its character. The four-wheel drivetrain added an extra 100 kilos. It took pretty much an extra half a second to get to 60 miles an hour. The other problem was that it was nearly £4,000 more expensive than the two-wheel drive model, and that put it in some pretty highly esteemed company. It was massively more expensive than the Lancia Delta Integrale, not far off a BMW M3 or even a Mercedes 190 that also had Cosworth engineering. For me, the key to the Sierra Sapphire Cosworth's success, though, is that it just uses tried and tested ingredients. That 2-litre Pinto engine's pretty much unburstable. By the time you get to the four-wheel drive models, you've got the YBG models, red cam-covered non-catalytic converter cars, and the YBJ models, which are the catalytic converter cars denoted by a green cam cover. But it still uses a 5-speed box, a rear axle that's Sierra Granada derived. It's all very simple and frankly unburstable mechanicals. It was a formula that really worked. It really gave that sort of halo effect to the Ford Sierra range. And nowadays, a Sierra Sapphire Cosworth is highly sought after, and the values reflect that. I try not to think of it as some sort of BMW M5 chasing machine, because I just think that would be wrong. It's too leaden, it's too heavy to feel like this sort of demonstrous sports saloon. The gear change is mechanical, a bit honest. The steering is frankly a little bit woolly. It doesn't provide the sort of feel that I think you'd want from a car like this. The suspension it's firm, but it's actually reasonably riding actually. It's actually remarkably refined as well. That Garrett C03 turbocharger is a little bit laggy, but the performance is decent. So in many ways there was a lot to criticise with the Sierra Sapphire Cosworth four-wheel drive when it first came out, but over 30 years on, history can be kind to this car, transformed from being that leery 1980s racer to a more genteel racer. And I think I prefer the character to this. But yeah, for me the Sierra Sapphire Cosworth is peak Sierra. And if you can't afford a Cosworth, it doesn't matter, because it's successfully sort of handed down some of that glow effect to those lower models, whether it's an XR 4x4 or even a GLS. All the Sierra models benefit from having the Cosworth in the family. I really like it.
When I was growing up, I had a scale extra set with a red black Mark III XR2i. I really loved the blue waistline trim and bumper insert. So when the RS Turbo version arrived around a year later and I saw the green inserts, I was wow. Now truth be told, the XR2i wasn't all that hot. As the name suggests, it was injected, but it only had 106 horsepower and could really be described as lukewarm. So when the RS Turbo arrived, the Mark III Fiesta finally had a hot variant. Now it's a bit simplistic to say that Ford took the engine from the Escort RS Turbo and plonked it in the front of the Fiesta. Yes, they did, but there were certain changes. Different engine management, different intercooler, different inlet tract, and different manifold. It also had the smaller Garrett T2 turbo rather than the T3, which meant it spooled up at lower revs. Exterior-wise, compared to the XR2i, it looked broadly similar. Same body kit, but of course you got those green accents, a couple of vents in the bonnet, and the all-important RS Turbo script on the boot lid. 14-inch wheels, which sounds tiny now, and the Fiesta RS Turbo is one of those cars that can make 3 spokes look good. Suspension-wise, Ford's special vehicle engineering department worked its magic with stiffer and lower springs, gas-filled dampers, and a rear anti-roll bar, which certainly stiffened things up. Contemporary road testers weren't particularly impressed. One of the big complaints was the steering. The RS Turbo had a quicker rack, but it does feel a little bit dull and uncommunicative. And at low speeds, the steering is exceptionally heavy. That said, the turning is pretty good. Very little body roll, courtesy of that stiff suspension. And it's only if you were to hit an undulation mid-bend that I think you'd have any serious problems. Pushing towards the top end, well, it's a 1600 CVH, so it is a little bit rough as you start to make progress if you're really ragging it, but at cruising speeds like this, it's perfectly fine and quiet. Interior wise, well, there wasn't a lot to tell it apart from a standard Fiesta, but you did get a nice leather rim wheel and these fantastic Recaro seats, brilliantly supportive. Fiesta RS Turbo Recaros are something of a legend in any modifying circles. But while it may not be the last word in vehicle dynamics, it is fast. Now, the official 0 to 60 time is 7.9 seconds, which is a tenth off a 205 GTI 1.9. But in the all-important 30 to 70 sprint, it's 0.7 seconds quicker. And you can feel that. There's loads of torque, and overtaking is really no issue. For a 1991 car, it's quick. You've got to remember when this came out, it was the fastest Ford this side of an RS Cosworth. The one thing it was not particularly cheap. At 11,950, it was £1,100 more than an XR2i, which makes it sound like a bargain, given all the rest you were getting. But it was also more expensive than a Renault 5 GT Turbo, a Fiat Uno Turbo, and curiously, a Lancia Delta HF Turbo, which was a much bigger car. But the thing is, Ford had this uncanny knack of brilliant marketing. So even when its cars weren't at the forefront of their game, you wanted one. And lots of people wanted an RS Turbo. Sadly, its life was quite short-lived. It came out in 1990, and by 1992, it was all over. New emission regulations and the need for catalytic converters spelt the end for the 1600 turbocharged CVH. And it came at a time when the Renault 5 GT Turbo was discontinued, the Fiat Uno Turbo was discontinued, and their replacements, bigger engine multi-valve cars. That meant the RS Turbo was replaced by the RS 1800, which had a 1.8 130 brake horsepower Z-Tech. It was a decent car, but it wasn't quite as quick as the RS Turbo, and not as fun or as frantic. Okay, it might not be as dynamic as a 205 GTI or quite as frantic perhaps as a Renault 5 Turbo, but I really, really like it. The memories it brings back for me and the way it looks means I'd love to have one of these on my driveway.
In the 60s and 70s, Ford built up quite the rallying pedigree with hotted up Escorts. An RS 2000 or a Mexico going sideways through a wood was a staple of rallying the world over. And keen to keep that pedigree going when the front-wheel drive Mark III Escort launched in 1980, Ford gave us 4 years later the rally-homologated Ford Escort RS Turbo. It sported much the same 1.6 litre injected CVH that we saw in the XR3i, but it now had a Garrett T3 Turbo bolted onto the front of it, and that took power up from around about 100 to 130 horsepower, which it got down to the ground through a viscous limited slip differential through 7-spoke RS wheels, not to mention a pumped up body kit to tuck those wheels under that was just that much beefier and more aggressive. The RS Turbo was loud, proud, and oh so 80s in its Ford diamond white paint. And despite the fact Ford only had to make 5,000 for homologation purposes, they ultimately sold 8,600 of them. Unfortunately, it wasn't without its flaws. It had a hard, bouncy ride, and to be honest, that fairly wooden XR3i chassis was in no position to cope with the extra power. Ford decided to keep the model going into the Mark IV Escort. So in 1986, we got the Series 2 RS Turbo. Ford wanted to make the new RS Turbo more oriented towards road driving, to make it a more usable, more comfortable, and less unruly beast. We got much the same Garrett T3 turbo on the same 1.6 CVH as last time, but the turbo was now water cooled, which not only kept under bonnet temperatures down a bit, but it meant you didn't have to leave the car running for a couple of minutes before you turned it off to cool the turbo down. There was also revisions made to the Bosch Cagetronic fuel injection to make power delivery a bit smoother and to improve the fuel economy. Yes, really. There was a revised intercooler to keep charge air temperatures down a little bit, and there were changes made to the driveline with a revised limited slip diff and shorter gearing introduced to not only improve the acceleration, but to hopefully quell some of the torque steer that the Series 1 RS Turbo was infamous for. The result is that the Series 2 makes about the same 132 horsepower as the Series 1, but it feels... Whoa! A lot more urgent to get it down to the ground. It feels quicker, it feels more lively. And you know what? We've heard all these rumours about laggy 80s turbo, but honestly, the Series 2 really doesn't feel it. And to make sure you could get that turbo power down to the road a little bit easier than in the Series 1, the Series 2 RS Turbo got improved suspension, stiffer springs, up-rated anti-roll bars, bigger brakes so you could pull up when you achieve that speed, and mechanical ABS was added to make it a little bit easy to pull yourself back if you did fear that you were going a little bit too quickly. It still can't hide its Mark III and Mark IV Escort origins. The steering's light and yet a bit dead, the front end is nowhere near as eager to turn in as a 205 GTI, and it just doesn't feel as light on its feet as the Peugeot or the Golf do. If the 205 GTI is a machete, the RS Turbo is a club hammer. It's not precise and it's not a sharp instrument, but whoa, still pretty blooming effective. Because of that stiffer suspension, it doesn't ride nearly as well as a 205 GTI or even as well as a normal XR3i. It's bouncy, it's harsh, and there are quite a few trim rattles when you do hit bigger bumps. The aggressive looks, the loud whistly turbo noises, and the uncouth manner in which you kind of have to drive it means the RS Turbo ended up with a bit of a reputation around it. This has very much always been the hooligan's car, but then again, hot Fords have always been like that. They've always been fast, loud, unapologetic, and put a smile on your face. And if that's what you want, the Series 2 RS Turbo is a fast Ford through and through.
Well, gents, 3 turbocharged icons, fast Fords of their generation. What's our preference?
Oh, it's going to be really tough. It's not as good, really, objectively, as a 205 GTI or something like that. But the way it looks and the nostalgia it evokes for me, I'm a big fan of that.
It looks fantastic.
Because arguably that's the last of the line. That's the last of that hot hatch era before insurance premiums kind of destroyed them, really.
Exactly.
So it's definitely of its time. And what about you, Joe, and the Escort RS Turbo?
This is an interesting one because, as you might know, I was underwhelmed by the XR3i. So I went into this with quite low expectations and it exceeded them. I love the noise, I love the looks, I think that it's boisterous and loud and proud, and that's brilliant. That's what fast Fords should be all about. It's nowhere near as sharp as a 205 GTI or a Golf. It is very much a club hammer. It's not perfect. I can't say that I'd own one. I think it would drive you mad regularly to own it. But it's good fun and it puts a smile on your face. I suspect you've had a bigger smile on yours.
Absolutely. I think, you know, we look back on these things with fondness, and there's nothing more iconic than a hot Ford, I think. But what I love about the RS Sapphire Cosworth is actually it's an evolution of the breed. Like we've gone from those sort of Larry Wildchild whale tail hatchback models to this more sedate, but it's a really accomplished package, I reckon, the Sapphire Cosworth.
Much more of a multi-purpose car than perhaps the original 3-door Cosworth is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Family car, as well as being a bit of a terror as well.
I'm going to be honest, and like I said with this, We like our fast Fords to be loud and proud, and the spoilers and the vents and the big green stripes down the side and the flared arches. But there's something about a fast Ford that's got a light that keeps it hidden under a bushel. And for that reason, I think of these three, this would be my choice.
Same. I like the subtle competence of the Sapphire Cosworth.
I'm going to semi-sit on the fence, sorry. That to drive home in, this to have in my driveway to look at.
Okay.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. Let us know in the comments, which would you choose of these three fast Ford icons? This video is proudly sponsored by Lancaster Insurance. Give them a call on 01480 400 889 for an insurance quote on your classic car. And don't forget to click the link below to enter their latest competition.